Okay, thank you. So welcome to O Human, Human Wherefore Art Thou, Cultivating and Sustaining Human Presence in Online Courses in the Age of AI. I'm Kirk Dupree, an instructional designer with Mizzou Online, as Tom shared. I recently got married and changed my last name, so updating my name everywhere has been quite the process. I still have to do the most important thing, the local library. Having fun isn't hard when you've got a library card. If you get that reference, you're incredible and awesome. Before we begin, I have 3 warnings, not necessarily warnings, just 3 advisories to share. The first is that this will be a very conversational and interactive session. I do not have all the answers, and I just have a lot of questions, and we'll learn from each other during this session. We're smarter and more knowledgeable together as a whole. To quote High School Musical, we're all in this together, so I'm hoping we learn a lot from each other during the session. Therefore, and this kind of leads into my second warning, there will be a lot of writing during the session. You'll be sharing your ideas and thoughts in the chat, as well as in a Google Doc. To quote the musical Hamilton, you'll be writing like you're running out of time, writing like you need it to survive. So just be warned, there is some writing. I'm a former English teacher, so I'm sorry in advance for that. And finally, as you might have already noticed, I do like to use a lot of nerdy and geeky pop culture references. So please bear with me and don't judge me, though you probably already are. But we're going to begin by actually looking back to about this time 6 years ago, the spring of 2020. Now, this was a rather dark and unsettling time because this was the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. But for a lot of us, there was one source of joy, something that maybe took our mind off of things as everything was shut down. The video game Animal Crossing from Nintendo, which they conveniently somehow timed to coincide with the shutdown because of COVID-19. Please react with hands clapping or whatever if you played this game or perhaps still do. Okay, I guess there's no reaction option. But anyway, some of us probably did, and probably some of us still are. But one of the most important things with this game was being present and engaged. If you don't visit your island for a while, we'd start to grow, your villagers start to become unhappy, and so on. And classes are the same. If you're not present or engaged, or if your students aren't present or engaged, things might start to get weird, or people might start to feel alienated, and so on. And so human presence is really important in online courses. In the chat, I'd like you to share your thoughts and ideas. Why does human presence in online courses matter? What difference does it make? Why is it useful? But take a couple of minutes and share your ideas in the chat. Why is it important to be present in online courses? Okay, if you're still writing in the chat, you can continue to do so, but a lot of ideas have poured in. A lot of us have noted the importance of community and the role of socialization, interaction, online learning, and just getting that sense of belonging and so on. So you've shared a lot of great points. And also, Tara's just shared a really great comment. Online learning is very isolating, and interacting with one another allows students to actively learn from each other, skills and lived experiences. And also, Charlotte shares a great point that it fosters a sense of motivation when there's that sense of connection, when they feel like they're cared for by the instructor and their classmates, they might be more inclined to engage in the course. So I really recommend scrolling through what everyone has shared, but there have been a lot of great points that we've shared. So I'm a fan of quotes, so I'm going to share a few of them before we proceed further. So here's one from Q et al. In 2012. Social presence is one of the most significant factors in improving learner satisfaction, enhancing instructional effectiveness, and building a sense of community. And here's another one from Pacansky Brock. I'm a huge fan of her work. Inclusive, asynchronous online learning experiences that are rich with human connection will be not only game changers, but life changers. And so these quotes really emphasize the impact that having that sense of connection, that presence in our courses can really make. And sorry for another pop culture reference, but ultimately, when students feel like they're cared for by their instructor and their classmates, they become a lot more motivated and engaged. Think of the Harry Potter books and movies. There's a huge difference between the learning experience students had with instructors like McGonagall and Lupin compared to Professor Umbridge. We really want to ensure that even in online environments, students feel that warm but demanding nature that McGonagall had, or that sense of care and concern that Lupin demonstrated. We want to show that to our students. And so in today's session, we'll be diving into and exploring the theoretical and pedagogical value and the regulatory context of presence. And we'll discuss the challenges and opportunities presented by both generative and agentic AI for human presence in online courses. And then we'll move into identifying strategies and techniques for cultivating and sustaining human presence in our courses, despite or even with generative and agentic AI. And finally, we'll examine our own teaching or instructional design context to develop a plan for building human presence moving forward. So we're going to begin with a bit of theory. I love theory, but there are some frameworks and requirements that really emphasize and clarify the value of human presence in online courses: the community of inquiry model, universal design for learning, and regular and substantive interaction requirements. These are probably familiar to a lot of us, but I'd like to briefly return to them and dive into them just so we're all on the same page. The community of inquiry model kind of argues that good online learning experiences consist of a sort of holy trinity of presences, three different kinds of presence: social presence, engaging with and interacting with one another; cognitive presence, being mentally and intellectually engaged; and then teaching presence, the engagement and involvement of the instructor. But this trinity of presences really creates something that's resonant and powerful for students. And UDL is something we often think about in terms of accessibility and inclusion, but one of the three areas of UDL is engagement, giving students multiple means of engagement, and human presence really fits in here. Within this engagement pillar of UDL, it calls for designing options for sustaining effort and persistence. So fostering collaboration, interdependence, and collective learning, and fostering belonging in community, so really getting students connected with one another. And also designing options for emotional capacity, developing an awareness of self and others, promoting individual and collective reflection, and cultivating empathy and restorative practices. UDL is something we often think about in terms of accessibility, but it really challenges us to build presence and engagement in courses as well. And finally, we have RSI, or regular and substantive interaction. For those unfamiliar with RSI, this is a federal requirement for online courses. In order to be eligible for funding, there has to be RSI, or regular and substantive interaction presence, but there has to be regular and frequent interaction between the instructor and students, and these interactions have to be substantive. They have to be meaningful. And something that we often overlook and maybe don't realize with RSI is that there's a huge emphasis on humanity within RSI as well. The Department of Education, has previously advised that using computers doesn't meet RSI expectations. An automated grading system that provides feedback based on a programmed response to input does not count as substantive because it is interaction with a computer, not an instructor. This guidance did come from the previous administration and preceded the advent of generative AI. I'm not going to get too political, so it's possible that with a more hands-off approach and more enthusiastic approach to AI, the current administration might offer differing guidance, but the most recent guidance from the Department of Education is that computers don't meet expectations for RSI. So we have these three pillars: the community of inquiry model, UDL, universal design for learning, as well as RSI, or regular and substantive interaction. But all of these frameworks, all of these requirements really articulate the value and importance of human presence. But there's a little elephant in the room that a lot of us have been wondering about and discussing and reflecting on for the last few years, and that is generative AI. And with that, students might be using these tools to complete all of the activities and assessments. The instructors might be using these tools to grade student submissions, to develop the entire content of the course, and they take a really hands-off approach. And so you kind of have to wonder if students are engaging with material developed by AI, but students are actually using AI to complete the assessments, and then the instructor is using AI to grade those submissions. Where is the human connection? It's possible an online course in an LMS like Canvas could kind of resemble Moldbook, which is, for those unfamiliar with it, a social network where only AI agents, AI bots can interact with one another. Humans can't make accounts, humans can't comment, we can only observe. But online courses could become a kind of Moldbook almost. And in addition to Animal Crossing, one of my favorite types of video games to play is liminal space games. One of the things that makes these liminal space games really creepy is the absence of any other human. They're just desolate, this huge void, this huge empty space you're wandering through. And online courses could come to feel like that for both instructors and students. They may wonder, is there anyone else out there? Is there anyone listening? Or I'm just wandering through here alone. And so this is the challenge before us. This is the elephant in the room. There's been a lot of concern about academic integrity and cognitive offloading, but human presence is one that I'd argue is perhaps even more important and more salient because academic integrity and cognitive engagement might follow being more present and engaged. And so what I'd like us now to do is return to the chat and respond to this question. How might generative and, for that matter, agentic AI impact human presence, either positively or negatively in online courses? How could they really hinder that human connection that's so important? Or how could they maybe actually enhance it? But take a couple of minutes and write and share your thoughts in the chat, please. Thank you to everyone who shared in the chat. If you're still composing your thoughts, please feel free to continue writing and posting them. There have been a lot of great ideas shared. Some of us have raised a big concern about offloading work and the ensuing disengagement, but then some of you have also identified ways that maybe AI could really help and promote presence. Maybe students really build upon it and engage with it, or the instructor uses it as an additional way to provide feedback to students that's deeper and richer than what they have the time to do. And so, as with all things in the world, AI is sort of a mixed bag. It can have a negative effect, but there's also ways it could be used and perhaps adopted and used meaningfully and effectively in online courses. So we've been thinking about and reflecting on just how AI will affect human presence. Now that we've thought about the challenges and opportunities, I'd really like us to think about and ponder how we could cultivate and sustain human presence in our courses. How can we have instructor presence? How can we have student engagement? And so instead of writing your ideas in the chat, though, I'd like you to go to this URL, tinyurl.com/AI presence. I've just dropped that in the chat as well. And when you open up that URL, when you go there, you will see a Google Doc. Let me briefly stop sharing so I can pull that up. But what you will see is this, and I've inserted many rows. So if you need to go further down or something, please do so. But what you'll do, if you want to share your name, you don't have to, you can be anonymous, but select a row and then put down your ideas. How can we sustain instructor presence in the age of AI? What can instructors do to really show they're present in the student learning experience and care about their students? Then in the last column, share your strategies for sustaining student presence and engagement. What can students do to show that they're still engaging with and involved in the course? But find a row and take a few minutes to share your thoughts. And again, I'm sorry for all the writing you're doing, but not really. Hey, it looks like a lot of us are wrapping up or have finished our thoughts. So I'll resume sharing my screen and return to that Google Doc. So you've all shared a lot of great ideas here. In terms of instructor presence, you noted possibly becoming more multimodal, especially with giving feedback. In addition, maybe using things like video announcements and so on. And so these are all great ways you've identified and shared for how to cultivate and show instructor presence and instructor engagement. And then multimedia or videos and so on were also noted a lot as a way to maybe get students engaged. Maybe video responses or audio responses would be great for students. We also noted ways that they could perhaps build upon and reflect upon the output of AI, and maybe using the groups feature in Canvas just to make things more pleasant and simpler for them, rather than that cognitive load caused by all that scrolling through Canvas or all that scrolling through this Google Doc that so many of us were contributing to. I'm sorry if that was kind of discombobulating, overwhelming, but this will be a nice resource to consult and return to in the future. But thank you for contributing to this. I've only glossed over all of your brilliant ideas. I recommend saving this, reviewing it, diving into it further after this session. Let me return to my PowerPoint quickly. Sorry. Okay, so we've shared all of these ideas. I'd just like to kind of recap and go over everything. So you noted the use of multimedia, things like video announcements or video feedback. Another thing we could possibly implement and adopt in our teaching is synchronous sessions. In asynchronous courses might be a challenge because you do have to offer students flexibility, maybe use a tool like LibCal or Microsoft Bookings, but maybe giving students the opportunity to meet with you, even just informally, throughout the course, maybe to discuss their ideas for an assignment. But this could really serve as a great way to check in on students and see how they're doing and really demonstrate that care and investment in their success. Another way students might really feel your presence and engagement is maybe incorporating recent events, things that they're seeing in the news or pop culture, having your own quirky interests, like my own bizarre ones, Animal Crossing, Harry Potter in this presentation, and maybe even throwing those into student feedback as well. Another thing is maybe showing your vulnerability and being your authentic self in your feedback, in your announcements, but making things more personalized and perhaps informal, maybe using emojis to a reasonable extent, or maybe allowing typos to appear in some of your messages. Maybe not too many, of course, you want to look professional, but maybe just showing your authentic, vulnerable self could be a way to show students that you're really putting your best self forward, your true human self forward for them in their learning. And then there are some ideas and some strategies for building student engagement. And I'd say these fall into two overarching categories. One is maybe changing our assessments and activities, and then the other is rethinking and reconsidering our overall classroom culture and perhaps even how we approach and perceive education. So I'm sorry, we're going to get a bit deep here in a moment, but before we get into that, thinking about assessments and activities. So I mentioned earlier in this session UDL, Universal Design for Learning. We could perhaps offer our students multiple means of action expression, giving them different ways to demonstrate their learning. If our learning objectives don't call explicitly and clearly for writing, could students maybe do something like a podcast or an infographic or a video presentation or maybe even an educational TikTok video? But could they maybe show their learning and demonstrate their achievement of the learning objectives in another way? I'm a huge fan of authentic assessments, but maybe giving students the opportunity to show their learning in a way that would really correspond to the work they do in their fields after college. So instead of just writing a generic essay in a business class, maybe instead they could compose a memo or a full report in the style of a business. And also, as a former English teacher, this is something probably some of you are familiar with, but writing as a process is something I really believed in. And so maybe breaking up those high stakes assessments and scaffolding them more would really lower the stakes for students. And it's possible they might still use and rely on generative AI to an extent, but you can incorporate more opportunities for them to really reflect on and analyze AI and how they're using it, and whether or not the output is really useful and helpful as they move toward the next step in that process. And of course, students could engage in more reflection, or we could incorporate more classroom assessment techniques, such as muddiest point or a 3-2-1, where they identify 3 remaining questions they have, and so on, or 2 huge main ideas they want to take away. But we could maybe use more classroom assessment techniques where they're really reflecting on and owning their learning. Of course, students could turn to AI to do these. Cheaters are going to cheat, at least for some students, but perhaps if some students are on that borderline, maybe if they feel like it matters to them more, they'll engage. And finally, maybe we could encourage our students to step away from the screen and maybe do something more hands-on and meaningful, maybe finding ways to include field experiences or service learning into our online courses. I studied English education as an undergrad, and so my last semester was all student teaching. That was a really hands-on field experience, and this maybe isn't necessarily feasible or reasonable in all disciplines, but maybe incorporating things like that, at least briefly, in more areas could be a way to kind of mitigate and offset those concerns about AI. So these are some changes we could make to assessments and activities, but now we're going to get a bit deep and think about how we could change our overall classroom culture and how we approach education. One simple thing we could do is practice transparency in learning and teaching, or TILT. For those unfamiliar with TILT, it really calls for us to consider and account for three things in the instructions for all assignments and activities. The first is the purpose. Why are we doing this? Often we just assign assessments and we don't tell students why. We don't connect it to the learning objectives. We don't explain why this really matters to their work that they'll do after school. But taking the time to really explain that purpose, that first section of TILT, could really build that intrinsic motivation in students who would otherwise be disengaged. If you're curious, the other two parts of TILT, or transparency in learning and teaching, are tasks and criteria. You can explore it more if you'd like. And then another thing we could do is simply lowering the stakes of assessments. I mentioned that previously with scaffolding and writing as a process, but maybe you could give students the opportunity to redo, focus more on mastery rather than less on doing things right the first time. Or perhaps we could have flexible deadlines where maybe the assignment is due on a Friday night, but let's be honest, students will have the weekend and you won't look at them until the following week. So maybe there could be a soft deadline of Friday and then a firm deadline of Monday morning or something. Or you could do late passes. Maybe each student receives a certain number of late passes and they can simply use them on a certain number of assignments throughout the semester, let you know that they'd like to use that on an assignment, and they can submit it late, no questions asked. And that way you don't have to worry about kind of the more arbitrary nature of allowing certain students extensions and other students not. And then these last few suggestions are getting a bit more deeper and maybe aren't as practical, especially because they call for more motivated and engaged students. And students don't know what they don't know, so students need to be at a certain level of knowledge to really engage with these. But we could perhaps adopt alternative grading models such as ungrading or mastery grading, or maybe even let students kind of decide on their own trajectory and select the topics to learn. Again, this calls for a certain amount of background knowledge and motivation, so this isn't practical in all contexts, but it could help maybe with upper level or graduate courses. And then finally, maybe we need to reconsider the transaction model that defines a lot of education. Now, this is getting really deep, but maybe instead of instructor providing content, students creating content, and then the teacher providing feedback on that content as well as a piece of paper at the end of your studies, maybe we need to rethink how we're just approaching things as a whole. So I'd argue that if we really want our students to engage, and this is a lot easier said than done, we need to find ways to really develop and build curiosity in students, that intrinsic motivation, and maybe have fewer demands for perfection, because AI is a perfection engine. Grades really encourage students to be perfect, and maybe we need to move toward embracing imperfection and learning and growth more instead. And this would really challenge how we approach teaching and learning in instructional design, and also perhaps even how our LMSs are designed. Again, this is easier said than done, and is a whole can of worms that we could spend hours dissecting and discussing. But ultimately, to get students engaged, maybe we need to take more time, make more of an effort to find ways to build that curiosity and that intrinsic motivation. Because at the end of the day, a lot of our education system nowadays is really focused on high grades. So on the screen, you'll see a meme. It shows an adult woman focused on a child in a pool, and the woman is labeled instructor and students, whereas the child is high grades, but then there's another child that's drowning, and that's actual learning. So we're all focused on high grades and ensuring things are perfect and clean and meet the expectations, but are we sacrificing learning and true mastery with the way things are set up right now? And perhaps maybe if we do allow for more curiosity and true learning, maybe student engagement would follow. And again, this is easier said than done, but it's something to think about. So time has flown by. It's already 2:40 Eastern time. But to wrap up, what is something you plan to do in your teaching or instructional design practice to promote human presence? What is something you think you could adopt and do just to build that instructor presence or that student presence moving forward in your courses? So many of you have already shared in the chat. If you're still composing and drafting your thoughts, you can continue to do so and then post them. But there have been a lot of great ideas shared, such as incorporating more video or maybe modeling effective AI use in low stakes settings and embracing UDL, thinking of ways we could give students more choices and options that might resonate with them more. Maybe students would connect more with recording a podcast than they would with writing a generic essay. So there are a lot of great ideas shared in the chat. So I recommend scrolling through that. So explore that as we're wrapping up. So thank you for attending this session. I noticed a few questions in the Q&A. One is about ungrading. So ungrading is kind of a fuzzy practice. People define it differently, but I'd say the main heart of it is that the instructor's trying to draw the attention away from grades. Perhaps maybe they use contract grading, or they focus more on effort, or maybe they give students endless opportunities to revise. But the main focus with ungrading, I would say, is that the instructor's trying to really draw the focus toward learning and the material at hand and less on getting that perfect point score in the grade book. But you can Google ungrading. There are a lot of resources and websites about it. But yeah, people define it differently. There's a lot of variation among instructors on how they approach it. But the main heart of it is kind of trying to get students to think less about grades in the end through various means. What other questions or concerns do we have? And Alyssa shared a great point. Setting up specs grading is fun in LMS. Again, LMSs aren't really designed to embrace ungrading. They really affirm and acknowledge and pursue traditional grading systems. So yeah, again, they're easier said than done, these alternative grading systems. Okay, so how do I personally incorporate AI in my classes and lessons? So I'm no longer an English instructor. I'm an instructional designer. I actually got out of teaching right before ChatGPT came on the scene. But something that I think I would do still in that context is maybe use AI to make writing even more complicated for students, get students really grappling with the output, analyzing it as they develop their thesis statements, their outlines, as they edit and revise. But instead of making things easier and simpler, maybe using AI to really encourage students to dive further into the chaos of their own thinking and ideas, the material at hand. So rather than making things simpler and clear, maybe using AI to make things more complicated and messy. And maybe you have to teach students certain prompts to achieve that, but maybe using AI more as a thought partner rather than as a cognitive offloader. But maybe like really adopting AI as sort of a devil's advocate to really get students thinking more critically rather than less. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I really enjoyed the conversation, all of your ideas.